He gave strict instructions that no one was to know this. Folks, it's a little hard to hide the fact that a once dying 12-year-old that many had already said was dead is now up and walking around again. But perhaps Christ's intention wasn't so much to hide what he had done, but rather to express or respond to the disposition of those who had observed it or those who had known of the event of the girl being sick and dying. We actually have two dispositions in this rather long gospel. And the woman with the hemorrhage seems to almost be like an aside, an imposition to the story. In fact, if you were looking in your missalettes, many of you might have noticed that there is a shorter version to today's gospel, which excludes the story of the woman with the hemorrhage altogether. But I always like to do the longer versions of all readings. It's my standing instruction with all lectors. Always do the longer reading. Because what we see in today's gospel, at least, are two spiritual dispositions in approaching affliction and turmoil. First, we have the woman with the hemorrhage. She has been afflicted for 12 years, the same number of years as is the age of the little girl. She had gone to doctors and had spent all her savings. There was no Obamacare at that time. And in fact, she had not gotten better, but had in fact gotten worse. She had every reason to be a person who had lost hope. And yet, what does she say to herself in approaching Jesus? If I but touch the tassel of his cloak, I will get better. There's a great hopefulness in her disposition. Despite everything that's gone wrong and has gotten progressively worse despite her best efforts, she nonetheless had that hope in approaching Jesus without even approaching him directly. And you notice, when Jesus addresses her, he does not tell her to be silent about what has happened. On the other hand, we have Jairus' daughter. When word spread that she had died, what was the disposition? Why bother the master any further? What point is there in having him come? She is dead. There's no point in bothering him any further. There's a great hopelessness in just a few words that are expressed. And there's where Jesus continues to tell them, where he had told the woman with the hemorrhage, your faith has saved you. He tells them, don't be afraid, you must have faith. Even when he says she is not dead but merely asleep, they ridicule him, and he hears the wailing and the commotion of great hopelessness, even though they have asked him to come and cure her. This girl of 12, the same number of years as the woman having suffered with the hemorrhage. Only in this particular case, after the miracle of raising the girl back to life, he tells the family not to tell anyone. We're in the midst of a new evangelization that the Holy Fathers, this one and the previous, have called us to engage in. And perhaps we see a slight message, maybe even a very harsh one, in how Jesus responds to those who are either doubtful of his intervention or have hope in it. And perhaps what we are hearing in this is for people who have no hope, for people who have such a negative disposition, for people whose faith does not lend itself to having hope, even in the miracle and the work of Christ, it is perhaps better if they say nothing to anyone. They might say the wrong thing. They might spread their own hopelessness. And so Christ's instructions are, despite the miracle, despite no doubt the joy that the family had in the raising of their daughter to life, do not say a word to anyone. We live in a world today in which there's great skepticism toward matters of faith and even people of faith. Sometimes people live by cliches and sayings that express deep attitudes regarding their faith. What are some of the cliches we hold on to? I mean, some of them are very popular, such as, all you need is love. Sometimes we feel the shallowness that goes along with many of these cute sayings, and yet if you have a response to the cliche, we see just how shallow and frail it is. It's like a house of cards. You knock down one cliche and the whole thing comes tumbling down. One of my personal favorites that I hear quite frequently whenever there is news of a public figure, be it a politician, a leader, an actor or actress, perhaps even someone in one's family, discovered to have fallen from grace, or perhaps in a position of great embarrassment, or perhaps great sin. We heard about it every now and again in political scandals. And what is it that people often say? Well, they're only human. They hide behind that phrase, saying, well, they're only human. But can you imagine just for a minute the direct insult that that comment is to the very face of God, and the low opinion that expresses of our humanity? We're only human. Reducing humanity to the lowest level of expectation, and that nothing more should really be expected of us. And yet, what is the essence of our faith, or at least part of it? As humans, we are made, created in the image and likeness of God, capable of knowing God and having a relationship with God, and capable of exercising self-control over our base animal instincts. We're not dogs or cats. We're not wildebeests or spotted owls or humpback whales, even though they have greater protection, I think, in this country than human beings do. We are human beings who can rise above our basic human instincts. And when a person does fall in such ways, it shows a tremendous failure in living up to how God created us and what God created us to be in his image and likeness. And yet all we have to say is, they're only human. What an insult that must be to God and his creation. We are not only human. We are human. And people who fall from grace are not only human, they are complete human failures. Failures in what God created us to be. And yet the phrase and the cliche, they're only human. What a depth of hopelessness and a low opinion of our humanity and God's creation of our humanity that expresses. But in today's gospel, we hear two other phrases or two other assurances, one of great hope, one of great despair. There are perhaps times in which we, as individuals, if we experience tragedy or struggle, sickness or illness, as families experience difficulty or turmoil, even as a church experiencing persecution or socio-political pressure, in which things continue to get worse despite our best efforts. What is the disposition each one of us have as we approach that as individuals, as families, and as church? On the one hand, we could say, what's the point? What's the hope in turning to God in times like these? It's gotten so bad, what's even the purpose of asking God for help? And yet there are others who would say, if I just hold fast to those values of my faith, if I but do not lose hope, if I rely on the grace of Christ to get me through this, I will make it through. We will make it through. We can see examples, both good and bad, in today's gospel. What's the point of bothering the teacher any further? She's dead. But if I just touch the tassel of his cloak, even after 12 years, I will get well. And without even having to address Jesus, the prayers, the disposition of the woman with the hemorrhage was answered, while Jesus had to constantly placate the crowd as he went to raise the daughter of Jairus. Let us, in the midst of whatever turmoil we may find ourselves as individuals, as families, as a parish, as a church, follow the example of the woman in today's gospel, that we never lose that hope in the aid that God gives us. And in the end, we don't even need to request that of God, because we know it's there to cure us, to help us, to save us, to lead us through those difficult times. Let us not be simply a people of a shallow faith of empty cliches. Let us be a people of true depth of faith, that do not lose hope in times of tribulation and affliction, but go forth from the depths of that faith to have an unending and undying hope in the aid that God gives to his people.